Hi, this is Jeff Denson, and you're watching For Bass Players Only.
Hi, everyone. John Liebman here. You're watching ForBassPlayersOnly.com, the place where all the old rockers like you come to learn how to groove on the bass, despite those annoying things like arthritis and tendonitis and other things that happen to us as we get older. ForBassPlayersOnly.com. And by the way, a lot of those old rockers happen to be jazz fans too. And if that's you, you're going to love today's interview. Jeff Denson is a bass player, composer, band leader, and in addition to his long association with jazz legend Lee Konitz, and I've got to ask you about that. Sure. Jeff has worked with the likes of Joe Lovano, Jane Ira Bloom, Bob Moses, Omar Hakim, Joshua Redmond, Gerald Cleaver, and so many others. He's the Dean of Instruction and a full professor at California Jazz Conservatory in Berkeley, California. And he has a new album out as a leader called Finding Light with Romain Pilon and Brian Blade, one of my favorite drummers. So we're definitely going to talk about that record. Hello, Dr. Denson.
Hello, John. Thanks for having me on.
All right. Now you are, I'm interested in the early days because I know you're originally from Arlington, Virginia. And I got the sense when you were growing up, you were into the typical stuff that most kids are into, rock and funk and stuff like that. And then as the story goes, you heard Miles Davis Kind of Blue. And then all of a sudden it was Charles Mingus and Ray Brown and Paul Chambers, of course, and Scott LaFaro. So why don't we start by seeing if you can connect some of those dots for me? So you could give me the picture of your musical upbringing, your initial exposure to music, and how you became a bass player.
So my first musical instrument was alto saxophone, which I started when I was in third grade. Now, I have no idea why, because that was too young. We didn't have band at that age. But I came home from school one day and I told my mom that, I want to play saxophone. Where I don't know where I got that idea, but I did that up until eighth grade. And then, I was a kid and I was hanging out with friends and playing video games and doing whatever else kids do. And I put the saxophone away. And then in high school, my friends would hear me singing with the radio. And then but the next thing I knew, I had a couple different groups of friends asking me to sing in their bands. And sing, so I've always sang since I was a kid, like singing along with any album my mom was listening to or that I had.
So your mom was quite the Beatles fan, right?
Absolutely, yeah. The Beatles and Elvis were like the big ones.
Very cool mom.
Yeah. So I'm singing in these groups, and like what happens with many bass players, it's like there wasn't one in the band. And at the time I was listening to groups with great bass players. Like you said, I listened to rock like John Paul Jones with Zeppelin and Paul McCartney with the Beatles. I mean, the Beatles hold a really special place in my heart just because of growing up with them like that, and Rush and, all the 90s bands. I mean, this is what I was really into. And my dad was really into blues and funk, and he would always tell me, you got to listen to James Brown. So I'd listen to James Brown and hear these like really pulsating bass lines. I thought, okay, that's a cool sounding instrument, and there's not one in the band. Maybe I'll try that. So I got an electric bass. I got an Aria Pro 2, like a used bass from somebody, and
that's a nice first bass to have.
Well, I spent, there was like $200 bass, and I fell in love like immediately. Not that I had like immediate aptitude for it. It was more of just like I was completely captivated by it. So I'd sit there and try to figure out how to play it. Had, like I said, it wasn't something like I picked it up and was like, I can play bass. No, it wasn't like that. It was like picking it up, wanting to play it, and being like seeing friends that were playing and then just thinking, okay, I've got to do this. And it became an obsession to the point that as I learned, like my friends couldn't take the thing out of my hands. Like I would sit and we'd all be in my house or in my garage and I'd be playing the bass and they're like, okay, Jeff, let's go wherever we were going, let's go out park or movies or whatever. And then I'd be like, okay, yeah, cool. And I would still play the bass. They'd be like, Jeff, let's go. I'm like, yeah, okay. Be like, Jeff, let's take the bass. It kind of pissed my friends off a little bit, but that's like what it did. Like it bit me like some sort of crazy virus. So it went from listening to these bands like I described, like John Paul Jones and Geddy Lee. And I had a bass teacher and he introduced me to Jaco Pastorius, hearing Jaco's solo record and like, I mean, like what in the hell is that? Like, is that even possible on the bass? So my mind was completely blown. I mean, literally. And he introduced me to a few other things like Return to Forever. That was another big one. And
The Romantic Warrior, was that a big one you listened to?
Actually, the one right before that, Hymn of the Seventh Galaxy, was the one that he turned me on to. And I'm hearing this stuff like, I mean, it was so virtuosic, and like the bass players are taking these amazing solos, and like, I mean, especially like Jaco, like these like just utterly amazing solos. I'm like, what is this? And then, I mean, and I could relate to the rock grooves on like Hymn of the Seventh Galaxy, because it's not that far away from, listening to Rush or something, it's like distorted guitars and rock grooves. And I said, okay, this is cool. I'm kind of interested in this jazz thing. And in the DC area where I grew up, we had a radio station, WPFW. So once I realized, okay, these are jazz fusion guys, and okay, these are fusion guys, and someone told me, well, you should listen to WPFW, the jazz station. So I put on the radio, I'm listening to it, and one day, like it's after I played the electric bass for a couple of years, like I was driving in my car and I heard So What come on the radio with Paul Chambers playing the melody, and it's like, whoa, what is this? And like I like crank up the radio and I'm listening to it, and then they say Miles Davis, So What? It's like the minute I heard So What, I decided, okay, I should rent a double bass. I should see what that's like, because I want to try to sound, make some kind of sound like that. Well, I rented one and found out, damn, this thing hurts my hands. It's hard to play in tune. This isn't easy. So I was kind of, and I was playing in all these rock bands. I was singing in some and playing at the same time, and playing in funk groups and auditioning for bands in Richmond, Virginia, and playing in the DC area. And I'm doing all these things around DC, Maryland. And like, I'm like, do I really want to do this? The double bass seems hard. And I got the Smithsonian Jazz Collection, that box set.
I know it very well.
And so I'm going through that, and Charles Mingus' Haitian Fight Song comes on. Again, it's like when I was in the car and I heard So What? I mean, like I think I even pulled the car over. And this moment, like I hear Mingus and it's like lightning struck me. And I'm thinking like, okay, I don't care if this hurts my hand. I don't care how hard it is to play. I'm going to play this bass because there's no way I can make sounds like that on an electric bass. And my life has never been the same since. Like that's literally a defining moment in my life. It's the day that Smithsonian CD got to that track and played Mingus's intro. Like, that's a very dramatic moment for me, because it's like that eliminated any or all escape routes or waffling or like thinking maybe I'll just stick to electric. No. So that changed my life. And from that moment on, I decided, okay, I'm gonna go somewhere. I'm gonna find someplace to study with somebody serious, study with a serious bass player, and go to school. So right after high school, I went to an art school in Richmond, Virginia for a couple of years to study visual arts. But the reason I chose that school was because they also had music. And like, so but I found out while there, like I'm taking more and more music classes and less art classes. And when I heard the Mingus tune, that's when I decided to go back home, and I enrolled in a community college there and found a great bass teacher in DC, Pepe Gonzalez. And then, I mean, it's like, okay, this is what I'm going to do. I'm going to become a professional bass player. And within 1 year, I was gigging enough to then move out on my own.
So this wasn't like Samandal and the bow and all that. This was jazz or
oh, it was jazz, but luckily Pepe was like, he's like, I don't care what you know, it's like, I don't care. You want to swing, we're going to swing, you're going to swing, but you've got to play with the bow. You have to practice with the bow. We have to use Samandal. And then he'd be like, little brother, I don't care what, I don't care. You don't like it. You're going to do it anyway. And that's like, all right.
When you discovered jazz, when you discovered bass, did you start seeking out records that Paul Chambers played on, that Ron Carter played on, that Mingus played on? Did you cultivate that part of it?
Yes, that's what happened. That's what happened. Like when, because at first it was like the transition, like the gateway drug was fusion, right? And like the thing is that period didn't last too long for me. So I didn't become like a fusion guy. Like I went from rock and funk to a very brief period of trying to check out some fusion. And it was literally like Jocko was king. And then Hymn of the Seventh Galaxy, Stanley Clark's solo record, Stanley Clark.
Yeah.
Because that was really like funk oriented. It didn't get like, I mean, like the more fusion-y it got, sometimes like then I would lose interest.
You wanted to tap your toe and snap your fingers and pop your head, right?
I like raw. I like things like a bit like, I mean, I like improvisation a lot, but I couldn't have articulated that at the time, but that's, you know, that's what got me. But I went from that to, you know, getting kind of blue and then wanting, and so then my guy was Paul Chambers until, until Mingus hit me, which is very, not that much time, but so then it was everything Paul Chambers. So checking out all the Miles records with Philly Joe and Paul and Red Garland, Wynton Kelly. That was the thing. I'd go to like Tower Records or go someplace and like look for Paul Chambers' name on the back. That's the one thing. Like the kids, like, I mean, they can find anything on the internet in 3 seconds. But that kind of mystery and not knowing and not like looking through things is something we're missing now with the ability to like say something very specific and have it pop up.
Yeah.
Right? But then it was like Mingus is like the prophet, I'm thinking like, this is my guy. And so then it was I go to Tower and it's like, go to the Mingus section because he had his own section. Paul, I would go to the Miles section, and I like Miles is, I love Miles's music. So, Mingus records, finding those, and little by little, I'd have friends that would tell me things. Like I made friends with a bass player who was 10 years older than me. And so it was so helpful because he threw all these names at me and made me cassette tape mixtapes of things. Like, so actually he made me a mixtape of all these different Scott LaFaro tunes, all these Scott LaFaro tracks, mainly the stuff with Bill Evans from Sunday the Village Vanguard, Waltz for Debbie. So, but when I heard that again, man, this was like, what, with the stuff with Bill Evans, I'm thinking like, dear God, like this, now Scott, this is the guy. So, I'm starting to like drop the names of like these are my greatest influences of people that like, they made me like my whole life, like they laid the road down in front of me. So with Paul Chambers, it was just kind of like the initial, just like, man, this guy's cool. I mean, like as cool can be.
A good way to ease into it. Nice straight ahead walking, and,
Yeah.
very
Masterful
accessible.
walking, great solos. And then Mingus was like,
Arco solos.
yeah,
Oh,
yeah, Paul, yeah. And then with Mingus, it was power. It was like, that's what really struck me first. And that really influenced the way I played the bass for a long time. I mean, it's still a big influence in me, but in my 20s, and I mean, it took me a while to learn, like, I don't have to try to tear the strings off the instrument. I mean, that was kind of what I would do every time I'd play. But yeah, so it was really going through Mingus, and then Scott LaFaro obviously opened up the Bill Evans canon. So then I found like I got all of the albums with Scott LaFaro, which ended quickly because he died so young. But then that, of course, led to Eddie Gomez.
I was waiting for Eddie's name to come up. Just a tangent here. I've got to interject. I don't know if you're familiar. There was an interview I did a while ago with Phil
Palombi.
Yeah, he did a meticulous transcription of those Scott LaFaro sessions that you're talking about at the Village Vanguard or Village Gate, whatever it was, Vanguard. It was Vanguard.
Mm-hmm.
And he even commented to me one time. He said there was a part where he's soloing on the bass, and somebody like knocked over a glass or something, and went and he went on the bass like to respond to it. So if you weren't aware of that, I definitely wanted you to check that out, because it's unbelievable. I met him at a convention for the ISB, International Society of Bassists, in Colorado, and Scott LaFaro's sisters were there because one of them had written a book, a biography.
Visions.
Yeah.
Scott, he opened up a whole like lineage of bass, like a way to play the bass. Like he opened up his own approach. And then from Scott, you have a whole line of bass players like Eddie Gomez, of course, before Eddie, Chuck Israels.
Yes.
But then
I interviewed him also at an ISB convention in Rochester, New York. I'm like, wow, do you know who you are?
Yeah.
What about Mark Johnson? Did you get that?
Yeah, and then he's after Eddie. Mark, but then that leads you to also Gary Peacock, whom I dearly love. And so when it's like following this line, it's like find Gary. Well, that leads me to Keith Jarrett.
Yeah. I don't know of anyone else Gary played with.
Gary played with everybody.
Well, I mean that tongue in cheek, but
I mean, some of his work with Albert Eiler, like, so I mean, he's very
not for me, I'm sorry.
Well, it's very avant-garde, it's free jazz. Super interesting. I mean, like, I think that, like, knowing that about Gary kind of sheds light onto his playing, because the way he plays in those free settings, I mean, he's super virtuosic, but then it's less about the melodic line and more about texture and density of notes. But his flexibility of like that is what makes him play the way he does with Jarrett. And he's
did I see Mark Dresser's name and the stuff that I read about you?
Yes, Mark Dresser was my last teacher. I mean, he's a huge influence, and he's a mentor. He was my mentor.
I met him once or twice, and very nice guy. I just don't find a lot of that music very accessible, if that's the right word.
Yeah, well,
not a big fan of Ornette Coleman, but I love Charlie Hayden. So
yeah, Charlie is another one that I would have to start talking about.
I interviewed him.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, it was a phone interview. It's transcribed. It's on the site. It's on ForBassPlayersOnly.com.
I'm going to check it out.
It's a funny thing about people who study jazz, that they tend to be able to play all kinds of different styles. I remember I was at the University of Miami, And I know you're a Seminole, but I decided to call you anyway. I'm a Hurricane. And for some reason, the conductor of the orchestra called everyone in the orchestra into his office, just one-on-one to play. We were playing a Stravinsky piece. I think it was Petrushka. And it's going, 5/8, 7/8, 4/4, 3/4, and I'm just, blazing through it. And he says, "Are you a jazz major?" I said, "Yes, I am." He says, "I thought so." He says, "You jazz guys can play anything." Something about jazz players, they tend to, because my degrees are in studio music and jazz, and what was the other one? Jazz performance and contemporary media. And it's called a jazz degree, but we played plenty of funk and we played plenty of, in Miami, a whole lot of Latin stuff.
Yeah.
And, it's just an observation that has become more and more clear to me over the years. So I wanted to share that with you.
Yeah, I think that's studying jazz is a great way to build your musicianship. It's time-based, it's groove-based, so it's like we learn about harmony, we learn about melody, and we learn about time, and you relate all these things to the groove. So that's the same in any kind of popular music. It's like groove-based music that deals with harmony and the harmony melody, but like with a pocket, right? So it doesn't matter if the pocket's or whatever the groove is, it's still got this. Right?
Yeah, absolutely. How did you hook up with Lee Konitz?
Like I finished the DC time, I go to Boston. So I went to Berklee College of Music. And I remember the first summer I came back home from Boston, I got together to play a jam session have a session with a friend of mine, a guitar player that went off to New York. He went to the New School, and we're like, okay, let's get together and play. And he brought over a stack of CDs. And so we play some tunes, and he's like, all right, let's listen to some music. He's like, I brought this one. I think you're really going to dig it. And specifically, I think you're going to like the saxophone player. His name is Lee Konitz. And he puts on the album, it was Kenny Wheeler, Angel Song. So like, this is now like Lee from 1999 or 1998 or something. I mean, it was like not, the 40s Lee or the 50s, 60s, So, and he was right. He puts that on. I'm like, holy, like, this is beautiful. I'm in. So I immediately, that next day, went and bought that album, and I listened to it over and over and over again. So we get back to the next semester, I go back to Boston. Well, who's coming to the Regatta Bar but Lee Konitz, right? And it's Lee Konitz with Paul Bley on piano and Steve Swallow on bass, on electric bass, right? And I sit right in the front row, and I'm watching, and I lean over to my friend who's with me, and I was like, someday I'm going to play in the Lee Konitz trio. And we're like, okay. 2 years later, I'm finishing up at Berklee, and I get a record deal with a German record company. Now I had an international trio with a German pianist and an Israeli drummer. The group was called Min Sarah. But the drummer and I ended up going there for 4 months. So I had to sublet my apartment. I moved to Essen, Germany, and I'm living in this little apartment with the piano player and the drummer. We record the album, after rehearsals, we record the album, and then we started performing to push the album in Germany. Well, somewhere near the end of that 4 months, I get called, or the piano player in the band gets called by a saxophone player, a Romanian saxophone player living in Cologne. And he said, I want to do a record. I want to use your trio as the rhythm section, and it's going to have Lee Konitz on it. And then the guys are like, oh, wow, cool. And I'm like, wow, cool. This is like one of my heroes. This is amazing. We're going to do it. And Lee really liked the trio. I mean, he thought, well, these are nice young guys. We're like 23, something like that. And he's like, these are nice. I like them. He came to 4 of our concerts. And after the 4th one, he said, why don't you guys come to my apartment tomorrow and play a session? And so we went to Lee's apartment and carried the bass and the drums up there. He had a piano. And he's like, let's sit down. Like, come here, sit with me for a minute. He's like, like, we're nervous. We're like, okay, this is Lee Konitz. And he's like, let's sing something. I'm like, what? Sing? What do you mean? What do you mean sing something? He's like, yeah, let's scat. He started scat singing, and we went around trading, and he's like, let's sing on a blues. And we're like, oh my God, okay. So we start.
That's like a once in a lifetime experience.
Yes. And we finish, and he's like, sounds like a band. We're like, what? And we didn't end up playing.
Well, so the guy dragged his drums up, and you took your bass up and everything. Wow.
Yeah. But then he asked us to play a gig. And so like that was our audition. Like,
that's really interesting. He wanted to get a sense of your musical sense.
Yeah.
Let's jump ahead to the new record.
Yeah.
Right. Tell me about that.
Well, so this is our second album together as a trio. Roman and I met in Berkeley, at Berkeley College of Music. We were students together, and we played together a ton, and in all possible things, like guitar and bass duos. We did trio with horns, trio with drums, larger groups. And
upright and electric at the time in Berkeley?
When I was in Berkeley, like pretty much no one knew I was a singer, and no one knew I played electric bass. The only thing I did all day long was play double bass.
So you're telling me about the record. It starts out with a tune in 5/4, which I thought was kind of interesting to kick it off that way. Daily Jubilee of Dancing Herbie D. And I read up a little more about you. I know who Herbie D is.
He's my baby.
He's your dog.
He's my dog. Yeah, he's my baby, my miniature schnauzer, Herbie. And yeah, that tune is like a grooving tune. It's kind of like New Orleans-ish groove in 5, and it's really about the groove. And I wrote it for Herbie because like I love him with all my heart. I've known Roman a long time. I reconnected with him, and then shortly before I reconnected with Roman, I got called to do a side play bass with Joel Harrison's Spirit House. He's a guitarist from New York. He came out to the West Coast, and his band was with Kermit Driscoll on bass, Kung Vu on trumpet, Paul Hansen on bassoon, and Brian Blade on drums. Kermit got sick, and they needed a sub. They needed someone to play bass, and I've worked with both Kung Vu and Paul. And so I think Paul was the one that recommended me. And, I got a call from Joel, and he told me who the band is, and it's with Brian Blade. I'm like, yes, I'll be there. And we had a great time. I mean, like an immediate connection. And at the end of the tour, Brian and I were like, we got to do something else together. So that was 2017. I started thinking about it. It was like, then I did a tour with Roman and was like, man, I've got an idea. And I know that these two guys together will make an incredible trio. And I talked to them about it, and they both were in. And so we recorded the first album, and it was just magic. Both Roman and Brian are like the sweetest guys you could possibly imagine. And they're both super amazing musicians. After we did that first album and we did those tours with the music, we wanted to do another album. But the plan was I thought we would go to the East Coast, and then we did. So we had the second tour. Our last concert was on February 11th, 2020, and the plan was next. Okay, I'm going to line up an East Coast tour.
Obviously, I know what's coming next.
Yeah, the COVID curtain fell. So the new album is really a result of like all those tours, because we made the first record and the chemistry is killer on the first album. And then we went out on the road, and it just seemed to keep growing. Like the band was just so tight and so flexible. And we had to record again because we grew so much together in that time.
But it's a great album. I like it very much. And the sound of the bass is so good. The sound of everything is good. I kind of focus on the bass for obvious reasons.
Yeah, it's the most beautiful of the instruments out in the world.
Absolutely. I know you are very much an educator with your gig, with very impressive title, Dean of Instruction and full professor at the California Jazz Conservatory. So I want to ask you to put on your educator hat for a minute.
Mhm.
At ForBassPlayersOnly.com, we are a bass instruction site, and people come to this site every day from all over the world to learn bass. And as I mentioned, by the way, that was a brand new tagline I used today. I'd never used that before. For old rockers like you, I've been working on that. That's the people that I seem to be attracting, men in their 50s, 60s, 70s who may have dabbled in the bass. They're not trying to make a career out of it. They want to play some classic rock riffs with their buddies, or maybe some walking bass lines or some blues, So in that context, what advice can you impart to somebody like that who wants to learn to play bass?
Yeah. Well, you just said the magic word, actually, and that's blues. I would recommend, for anybody that wants to play music in the United States, and if they're like open to different styles or whatever, or they're like into one thing, like blues is the heart of all American musical forms. Like you can find it in obviously blues, electric blues, Delta blues. It's obviously that, but in jazz, 100%. And I look at blues as not only like a style of music, but a form. It's like a musical form, the blues form. And we could talk longer about that. The most typical is obviously 12-bar blues, but there could be 16, there could be more. And then language, it's a language. Like, how does someone say, oh, that sounds bluesy? Like understanding these three elements, like, okay, this is the style, this is blues as a style, this is the musical form of the blues, and this is blues language. This is a key to understanding playing any kind of a US American music. Whether it's because country music, put on Willie Nelson. Well, sure enough, you're going to hear some blues. Put on, Appalachian bluegrass. Sure enough, you're going to hear blues. All like funk. Put on James Brown. Sure as yes. Put on Led Zeppelin. Yes. Put on any classic rock. Yes. Right. Like you're going to get it, and you're going to get some dose of those. A lot of times, you're going to get the straight up form that's going to be used. And then the language, the isms, like blues isms, the use of blue notes, the use of bending notes. Like this is key to playing any music in the United States. Absolutely. Motown, R&B. It's just like, that's going to gospel. If you study the blues and practice playing blues and learn to hear those progressions, and because there's some basic things that occur, it's like harmonically, we talk about like the 1, and then we're going to eventually go to the 4. Now the turnarounds change. They can be more or less complicated if you're looking at bebop blues progressions as opposed to like electric blues or country blues or something. But once you get into that and you hear it, and it's like, oh yeah, of course. You start hearing all the tunes all over the place. They're like, that's a blues, and that's a blues, right?
Why don't I get that answer more often? It's so obvious. Led Zeppelin, it's, like Willie Dixon and, Lead Belly or Muddy Waters, or, people like that. Those are in pop songs, rock songs, hard rock, metal songs. Yeah, you're right on. I do have one more question for you. If you can imagine, what would you be if you weren't a bass player? Something outside of music. You can't say a saxophone player.
Probably either a visual artist or a forest ranger. Those are the things when I was a kid, I thought. It's like either that I want to be a forest ranger. For a long time, it was that. It was like something in nature, or then it was like visual arts or music. So,
well, Jeff, this has been great. I'm so happy we were able to do this. I've been looking forward to it for a while. I've been following your music. I guess it's not your record label or your publicist or somebody sends me updates on your stuff. And that's how I first became aware of you. And I'm very glad that I did. And I'm happy everything worked out. So congratulations on your success. Keep doing what you're doing and safe travels overseas. I'm glad that COVID is kind of behind us and the world seems to be getting back to normal. Even if it's still here, we sort of figured out ways to deal with it, which is good. And I know there's a lot of pent up energy that a lot of musicians and a lot of non-musicians have been experiencing. So it's good to be back. Thank you so much. I'm John Liebman. You're watching ForBassPlayersOnly.com, where old rockers just like you come to learn how to groove on the bass, despite things like arthritis and tendinitis and other things that happen to us when we get older. And as I mentioned earlier, a lot of jazz fans we have too. And I thank you very much again to our special guest, Jeff Denson. Check out the album Finding Light. In the meantime, I will see you all next week. You're watching ForBassPlayersOnly.com. I'm John Liebman, founder and first baseman. Let's play bass.